Good evening to all the participants and welcome to you all in Bangalore chapter program. And this is also, we have a great speaker with us. We have Lieutenant Colonel Allan Burby, Advisor Business Ethics and Compliance with us. Allan promotes the embedding of strong ethics and compliance processes, practices, measures as a competitive business differentiator in sustaining a culture of people-centric business. Allan, a Tata veteran, he has designed and facilitated ethics and compliance programs across industrial sectors like automotive, aerospace, edutech, energy, retail, beverages, material, IT and ES, infrastructure, finance service, airlines, hospital, and so on. He is advisor to integrity matter on business ethics and go-to person for business entities within which updates the conviction that ethically operated business are competitive and sustainable. And he is currently involved in deeper engagement to grow interdependence between Education Ministry and MSME's entrepreneur fraternity. So my association with Allan is long. After he is a veteran from Indian Army. After that, he joined TCS, and then he moved to Tata Quality Management Services. The services which monitors the ethics and compliance part of all Tata Group of companies. And he is instrumental in implementing deep check surveys in many Tata companies, which helps the Tata companies to find out their ethical standings. He is fully involved in this process, and I think he is one of the best proponents of implementation, education of ethics and compliance in our country. And today, basically, the topic is very important. You know, in Tata companies, I worked for more than 34 years. Allan also worked very long. Why we work in a group? In the group, when we work in a group, this group is embedded with very rich value system with ethics and culture. So if we don't have ethics and culture in place, normally young people don't stay. And when people are encouraged to take right decision, in that scenario only a company or a person can excel. So that is the main theme, how we can get more, how we can encourage our people to take right decision, right work, and to do their work much beyond their call of duty. How we can motivate people. That is the basic thing which an ethics and compliance system or an ethical values a company that gives to the organization. Now over to Allan. Thank you very much for taking our request. So today's topic is high performance culture and ethics and compliance perspective. Thank you very much. Allan, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amal. I hope I live up to a fraction of the glorious reputation that you've talked about me. I'm very honored to be invited by the Institute of Internal Auditors in India by Mr. Amal Kundu on behalf of Mr. Krishnan Venugopal to share my thoughts on the topic of high performance culture with specificity on the ethics and compliance perspectives. I feel, friends, extremely humbled addressing this fraternity of internal auditors because upfront, let me confess, my knowledge about internal audit is rudimentary at best. I shall focus mostly on the aspect of the role of leadership in demonstrating behaviors that impact the motivation of people who work with them and for the company in the workforce, positively or adversely. My talk is for about 30 to 35 minutes, and I'm very keen to follow that up with a question and answer round with each of my friends in the audience. Kindly share your questions on the chat box feature on this platform. Time permitting, I shall respond to all the questions. In case signal strength at my end drops, I shall reconnect as fast as possible. I take this opportunity to thank each one of you attending this webinar today. And my thanks also to the organizers at the Institute of Internal Auditors for hosting this event. And a special word of thanks for Amal Kundu, a friend of mine, an ex-Tata colleague, and Menaz, a new friend who I've come to know the last 2 days from your fraternity, for assisting me today. What I will talk about with a group of slides touches upon the following tenets, all related to a high-performance culture. So firstly, what is culture? In my opinion, what should be the ABC of forming or shaping a culture? The importance of behavior, the impact of behavior on the motivation of people we work with. I will share then a couple of scenarios which I've pulled out from previous experience, both within the group, Tata Group, as well as outside the Tata Group. We shall pose a lot of questions, which I term for the session as questions of conscience, and to help you really relate to what the topic is all about. And then I shall end with some implementation tips relative to the question, what does an effective ethics and compliance program look like? We end with a recap and then get into the question round. So friends, let's move to the first slide on who shapes culture. Next. Examine the slide for you. Leaders at any level are the most important people that shape a culture. And how do they do this? They do this by their actions and conversations on ethics and compliance. And these actions and conversations help to either promote the brand, and that's the ethics side of the picture, or de-risk the brand, and that's the compliance side of the picture. Together, ethics and compliance helps co-create the competitive business differentiator. Next. So the aim of this talk today is to discuss how to build a high-performance culture by leveraging motivation, which is at the core of ethics and compliance. Let's look at some benefits of an effective ethics and compliance program. Next. By choosing consciously to behave and act ethically, one can enable improved levels of motivation, consciousness driven by inner governance, we'll talk about that a little later, capability to act, reflect and decide, confidence to debate, to reason, to question and also to speak up, collaborate wholesomely with an attitude to serve others first, and operate from a purpose-driven mindset. And the outcomes are higher productivity and profitability for the business, improvement in terms of reputation and brand of the desired kind to be sustained, and desired talent gets both attracted and retained. Let's look at some key components of such a program. Next. In an effective ethics and compliance program, to be able to understand what are the key components, here is a list of them, the first 5. Firstly, the need to assess or evaluate the existing culture, establish a baseline relative to measures on why, what, who, how, where, then design a roadmap for the desired culture, script a plan of action in terms of vision, objectives, timeline, effort costing, etc. Implement the roadmap and review performance to plan. The lower half of the slide talks about how do you implement a roadmap. You need a structure, you need review of the efficacy of existing processes, policies, and mechanisms. We need to commence some new initiatives which get thrown up from that baseline that you've established, which I talked about in the first part of the slide. Check compliance, conformity across various dimensions, measurement of effectiveness in terms of plan, do, check, and act. And then finally, benchmarking, mostly internal benchmarking with what we do and how we do it best before we go for external benchmarking. Now I'll talk to you a bit about enhancing a high performance culture. And the operative word is culture. This is what Edward T. Hall, an anthropologist, cross-cultural researcher, and author says about culture. He says culture is man's medium. Next. There is not one aspect of human life that is not touched and altered by culture. This means personality, how people express themselves, including shows of emotion, the way they think, how they move, how problems are solved, how their cities are planned and laid out, how transportation systems function and are organized, as well as how economic and government systems are put together and function. However, that is culture, is frequently the most obvious and taken for granted, and therefore the least studied aspect that influences behavior in the deepest yet most subtle ways. Today, I have chosen to spotlight the human-centric dimension of culture with motivation at the core of a person's individual and collective performance. Within the dimension of motivation, I will dwell upon the intrinsic and extrinsic factors, but chiefly on extrinsic motivation because culture, in my opinion, is largely shaped by leaders at any level, as it is mostly a qualitative outcome of human relations between two persons or a group of people, small or large. The ABC of culture to my mind emerges from the A, that's one's attitude, to perform a task, read willingness or commitment, and C, that's one's competence, read aptitude toward the type of task to be performed. The central alphabet B then is the secret sauce that bridges the A and the C. What could the letter B represent? I guess you've already spotted that word. Let's reflect upon a simple definition for extrinsic motivation from the dictionary. Next. So extrinsic motivation is when we are motivated to behave, engage, or perform in an activity to either earn a reward or avoid a punishment. One will engage in a behavior not because one finds it satisfying or enjoys it, but because one expects to get something in return or avoid something that's unpleasant. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is when one finds it personally rewarding to perform an activity or behave in a particular manner for its own sake, rather than expect or desire an external reward. The behavior itself is reward enough. Next. Please focus on this slide for more than a few moments. It showcases the priority for behavior, even though it's a 2006 statistic that I'm bringing forward for you. Read what it says. And this is in the context of corporate business setting, global. Across all types of transgressions, 91% are behavioral. The balance 9% transgressions account for fiduciary and cash-related violations, misappropriations, and fraud. Why is this particular statement and this statistic of significance for each one of us? If I was in the finance space, or if I was, with all due respect, in the internal audit function or in the accounting fraternity, I am mostly concerned with the second part of the slide, the 9% transgressions, which is all about cash and fiduciary violations, misappropriations, and fraud, as also keeping the attempt to keep everything above board. But just imagine that 91% of transgressions in a corporate setting are behavioral. Are we quite often missing the wood for the trees? Now, when the environment is vitiated by offensive and inappropriate, and sometimes retaliatory vindictive behaviors by reporting managers, there is a perceptible drop in the number of concerns raised and cases reported in an entity. The outcome is an erosion of trust in relationships, and such a trust deficit stems from fear, cynicism, psychophancy, or hypocrisy. So how should we build capability and confidence in reporting, particularly by employees and third-party vendors and suppliers? Let's zoom out of the discussion so far to examine the Tata Group's mission statement, which I'm reading out to you very briefly as a term of reference. The Tatas believe that their purpose is to improve the quality of life in the communities they serve in. And how do they believe they can accomplish this? The heritage of returning to society what we earn will be continuously enriched by formalizing the high standards of behavior expected from employees and external stakeholders associated with the brand. Now, can we pause just for a moment and explore whether this group's mission statement resonates with the recent buyback of Air India, the national airline carrier by Tatas? Just think for yourself. Do they mean what they say, or do they say what they mean, or both, or none of it? Now, why are we discussing this topic today? How significant is the challenge and associated risks? This is the real elephant in the room question, isn't it? Now, here's a statement that's going to come up on the slide soon after this. And it's Tony Robbins, the author of Awakening the Sleeping Giant in You. And keep this statement with you even after the session for as long as you want to understand what goes into culture and how culture should be built. Next. Tony Robbins simply stated 5 words. We become what we tolerate. And as we see now, when we go into the latter part of the session in scenarios and questions of conscience, what are the kind of behaviors we are tolerating? Which are the ones we are intolerant of? Which are the ones we are condoning? Which are the ones we are accepting? And which are the ones we prefer not to look at? Next. Here are a few scenarios for you. Kindly read it out, but I'm going to read it out in case someone's video is not very clear. So I hope you can hear me on your audio channel. Scenario 1. A few years ago, a company received an accreditation in an annual business ethics and compliance evaluation. Yet barely 6 months later, The CEO and a few senior leaders were found complicit in misappropriating a large sum of money, company funds. Post investigations into the matter, they were dismissed by the board. Is the board justified in its remedy for the situation? Think. Next. In another company, I'm sorry. In another company, the CEO was implicated in an allegation of inappropriate behavior with a female colleague, and as a result was transferred to another business unit. Could the board have decided upon a different remedy for the situation? What do you think? Next. Scenario number 3. As a norm in company ABC, when vice presidents or senior managers are found complicit in wrongdoing, they are transferred to another location or another business unit. Is the CEO and the board justified in its remedy for the situation? What do you think? Next. Scenario 4. In yet another company, a senior leader was alleged to have repeatedly used abusive language at a female colleague. Despite a complaint having been formally reported and investigated, this leader was retained in his position. A few weeks later, the aggrieved female employee left the organization of her own volition. Was this matter addressed in the most appropriate manner? And do you believe there is scope for miscarriage of justice here? Next. Scenario 5. In quite a few companies, for a case of financial impropriety or fraud or financial imprudence of significant proportion by a senior high performer employee, a tendency lurks in the organization to treat the senior or high performer with more consideration and compassion when compared with a junior employee who gets summarily terminated for a relatively minor false transgression, a claim of reimbursement of medicines purchased. False one, that is. The question is a standard yardstick applied in consequence management, irrespective of the level of the perpetrator in our organizations? We become what we tolerate. What are we tolerating? What is the culture we want to set? What is the tone we are setting, and what are the messages that are getting corrupted when we say we are ethical and this kind of differential yardstick exists in an organization? Next. Some questions of conscience, just for you to reflect upon. Can we identify some causes for the widening gap between knowing and doing in business ethics and compliance? How do we accommodate voices of dissent in a fair, just, objective, balanced, and professional manner? And here's a statement and a question. There is apparently a mysterious rise of the wrong people in leadership positions with damaging effect on others in the organization. What is the guidance for startups in this disregard? Now let's reflect. When competency trumps character or conduct or the desired behavior, what is the fallout of such a choice or such a decision, such a mindset? How does such a trend play into the equation of a high performance culture? Do we tend to overlook inappropriate behaviors in our leaders in deference to the leader's high performing result orientation in business? Next. What lessons can we draw from empirical evidence on fraud? For Generation Next, Within the purview of a multi-generational diverse workforce, how best can the domain of culture be leveraged for augmenting performance? Next, statement and question. Using one's power unfairly against seemingly powerless, less powerful colleagues, subordinates, or external stakeholders. What are some ways and mechanisms to mitigate the abuse of power in business? Let's think about it. Next. Therefore, the deeper questions are two, can we hold ourselves to account for commoditizing human capital in our business? And secondly, why have businesses in general seemingly reduce human capital to a transactional level rather than pivot business performance on the fulcrum of motivation as core to almost infinite human potential? Let's think about the second question for a few moments, because this is at the core of the session on why motivation is at the core of an ethics and compliance program in building a culture of high performance. Next. We have two incidents for you, and let's see what lessons can we learn from each of these incidents. So let's call to mind a media bite on Tech Mahindra, which was several years ago, close to a decade ago, and the issue spotlighted then was about unfair, unjust HR separation. This soundbite from Tech Mahindra episode went viral, if you do remember. It compelled no less than the chairman of Mahindra & Mahindra to publicly assure the industry that these incidents would not recur. Two questions. Spot the correlation between an organization's culture and its performance in terms of this scenario. Second, what lesson do you think is spotlighted by the action of the top leader at Mahindra & Mahindra, who came publicly and declared to the world at large with a public assurance that these incidents would not occur? Does it talk about accountability at the highest degree when he could have chosen to stay behind and have somebody else speak on his behalf? I told you, friends, this session is mostly about the role of top leadership, and that includes you and me because we are top leaders to several people who report to us. Next. The second incident, some years ago, a few students from one of the Indian institutes of management were rusticated for plagiarizing their answers in an assessment. Now, how does one counterbalance competitive pressure on one hand with principal performance on the other? Now, these are B schools. These are the creme de la creme in terms of the academic world moving into industry. What kind of a tone, what kind of a setting do we need to set for them? Yet not bind them or inhibit them from being as creative and joyous in whatever they're striving to do. Do we have a similar kind of challenge when we're handling talent in our respective organizations and high performers as well? These questions of conscience, these incidents and these scenarios all boil down to behaviors, don't they? Which types do we condone? Which types do we promote? How best to set the right tone and sustain it? Friends, think about this. Is there a correlation between the word corruption in behaviors in context of culture? We quickly now moving to a very important question. What does an effective ethics and compliance program look like? I'm going to share some implementation tips with you. Next. So the source is Mitra Tech Holdings. This was on the 18th of August 21 in my research. So Mitra Tech Holding tells us what it means to drive an effective ethics and compliance program. So a company culture that encourages ethics and compliance with the law, clear responsibility on part of senior management, active, ongoing oversight by the board of directors, day-to-day oversight by high-level individual who has sufficient resources and authority. And this could be, for instance, the chief ethics and compliance officer of your organization. Next. Here are some more tips, again from Mitra Tech. Effective communication of standards and policies throughout the company with all stakeholders. Periodic training for all stakeholders, including the board, management, and employees. Reasonable steps taken to achieve compliance and consultation, such as monitoring and reporting systems or helplines. Incentives for compliance with the policies in place, appropriate response actions kick in when offenses are detected, and consistent enforcement of corrective and disciplinary action towards stakeholders are in place. The next slide, I've added a few of the implementation tips from my experience, and I hope they had value to you in the session. Next. In addition to what Mitra Tech told us, periodic sharing of information about actions taken on cases reported and investigated with key stakeholders needs to be shared with your stakeholders. Effective channels and mechanisms for responding to cases of misconduct are in place. Whistleblowers feel acknowledged and assured in having done the right thing for their courageous act. Each person in the stakeholder community feels free to ask or raise a query, raise a concern, or report a contentious matter without fear or favor. Ethical conduct of each leader at each level is recognized as a core KBA, key behavioral attribute, in the performance management system in the business entity. In addition, you can start conversations with your third parties, extremely important part of your ecosystem. They can tell you much that you may not know about what's happening within your organization. Next. Now, this is what Deloitte has to share for us, okay? Now, Deloitte tells us that a cultural assessment of your organization can help you determine where you stand currently and if you're ready to build and implement a good ethical compliance initiative. Deloitte recommends some questions which you can use if you have the right company culture for an effective ethics and compliance program. They are listed out for you on the slide, but I'm reading them out one by one. Does your company culture encourage ethical behavior at all levels? The word encourage was used by Amal in the introduction. It's about motivating people to do the right thing at the right time, promptly. Can all of your employees describe the company's code of ethics? Are they aware of what the code of conduct and ethics and what does it mean and what they are supposed to stand by? Do your employees understand the tone set by senior management in terms of their actions, behaviors, and conversations? Do all your employees feel free to ask questions at any time and express concerns without fear or favor? And do your employees believe that mechanisms are in place to allow them to voice opinions without fear of retribution? The results from this assessment by Deloitte became the benchmarks that could lay the foundation for an ethics and compliance program as well as an effective control environment. There is an integral thread of values in culture, friends. We are aware that culture could mean several things. To my mind, culture embodies how a person is or people in general are treated and as a significant outcome of another person's behavior, whether they feel valued or not. So let's understand why is motivation at the core of a human being's performance in business. Next. When people are valued, they feel motivated to not only perform well, but also travel the extra mile and excel. On the other hand, a person who is devalued performs half as well or even less because he, she, or they feel demotivated. In this context, it is imperative to be cognizant of positive values-based behaviors alongside negative or potentially limiting values-based behaviors. Positive values-driven behaviors enable and boost one's performance, while potentially limiting values disable and cause a drag or drop on the person's motivation levels. Expanding this canvas, it pays to remind ourselves the what and how of the impact of behaviors aligned to spurring motivation in next-gen workforce, that too in a multicultural, multi-stakeholder ecosystem. In this canvas, the behavior of leaders is the most crucial imperative. Friends, ethics is a journey more from within oneself, originating from a space of inner governance. You'll remember I mentioned this early in the talk. And this is when one listens to one's inner voice or examines one's conscience, as against compliance, which is largely imposed or impressed upon us by an external source. Sharing a few words recently stated by Sachin Malpani, a small-time entrepreneur from Pune in India, he said, and I quote, "Good is not good enough when better is possible. If there is room for improvement, there is scope to improve something starting with myself first," unquote. Sachin drives a high-performance culture in his business, guided by a daily practice of inner governance. In ending, here are a few questions to reflect on. Next. What could it mean to focus on beyond the obvious in operating a values-based culture in a sustainable business? Question one. Second, for leaders, and each one of you on the call, as leaders in business, can we dwell far more upon values such as compassion and creating psychologically safe spaces for our people? Next. Third, what could it mean to be more balanced in terms of ethics and the legally compliant world of business? And last, but again, the most important for the session today, is each person's motivation at the core of the organization's culture for ethics and compliance with all stakeholders? Next slide to recap. Who shapes culture? Leaders. How? By behaviors and conversations aligned to the purpose of business, so as to promote the brand with ethics, de-risk the brand with compliance to co-create a competitive business differentiator. Thank you, friends. I'm open for questions. Last slide, please, Menas. So Menas, could you feed me or tell me questions which have come up on the chat box?
Yes, sir. We have a question from Mr. Vishwanath Ramani. So his question is, while organizations take strict action, unethical behavior, do you think they don't acknowledge or celebrate ethical behavior, especially under trying circumstances?
Thank you, Mr. Ramani, for this question. I'm just reminded of something I heard some time ago, is before you look at the speck or the dot in another's eye, look at the specks in your own. And this is human nature. Human nature is to look at the imperfections, to look at the faults, and all from our perspective. So we are, and I'm reminded of a book which reminds me that we are intrinsically judges of situations, judges of people, judges of behavior, and judges of everything. And we don't, for the most part, harbor a learner mindset. A learner mindset is open to, as you very rightly showcase, the good as well as the not so good. But organizations and systems, as we looked at that statistic of 2006, 9% are about misappropriation of frauds relative to fiduciary and cash. And for those 9% of transgressions, we've got finance departments, we've got accounts departments, we've got internal audit, we've got external audit, we've got the regulator, and we have who knows who. But for 91%, who's really in charge or responsible for the 91%? It's human nature to take for granted what they believe is kosher. Oh, if the person is behaving ethically, that's what he or she is expected to do. But sadly, you've pointed to a very, very glaring truth. We need to promote the brand by celebrating those who are ethical more than spotlighting those who are not ethical. Those who are not ethical, we have mechanisms, we have structures, we have people to deal with them, to help firstly correct them. And if they refuse to be corrected, then we have reasons for dealing with them adversely. But in most cases, many bad apples remain in the organization, and over a period of time, they will corrupt other apples as well. Goes back to the statement, we become what we tolerate. But thank you for raising the flag on a wonderful question. We must celebrate, we must acknowledge, and we must really build systems to celebrate what's going right, what's going on ethically, in addition to pointing out what's going wrong. And I would say 90% celebrate the positive, 10% deal with the negative. Because that would be aligned to the 91%, 9% statistic. Thank you. Next.
Yeah, so the next question is from Mr. Azam Ali. He needs to know that usually we cannot raise our voices against the senior management if they are doing something wrong. So how do we deal with the situation?
Thank you, Mr. Ali. Another great question because it strikes at the root of motivation. People like us, please include me in this group, fail the test quite often of raising our voices to our seniors when we know, when we believe, and even when we have factual evidence that the seniors are either indifferent to the wrong which is going on or they are complicit in the wrongdoing. And that's because of the imperfect power equation between the senior person and the subordinate. One of the questions I touched upon in the session was, how do organizations dispel that power? And it has to start with leaders and the topmost leader. Now, I talked about the Mahindra and Mahindra episode on Tech Mahindra. The chairman of Mahindra and Mahindra need not have come up publicly and stated that I want to assure the public that this kind of lapse will not happen again. Imagine for the people who were serving in Tech Mahindra and the rest of the Mahindra and Mahindra group, how much oxygen that kind of act of the chairman of Mahindra and Mahindra infused into them to do the right thing going forward. That's what, friend, is called setting the tone. And if you have leaders who don't set the tone, you need to find ways in having conversations with the people that matter. I'm sure in the leadership team, if it is not the leader you're reporting to or not your senior most leader, you can ask them and bring this matter up to the fore in a matter which is non-threatening, but yet needs to be dealt with. And it's in organizations which have no channels, either formal or informal, for these conversations to happen, where the adverse power play always impacts people adversely. And that's why people like you and I quite often may fail the test in raising our voice. Good organizations open up conversations, and that's why I used in my second and my last slide actions and conversations And the last slide was behaviors and conversations. Unless organizations and entities, large or small, promote conversations, people will not feel free, confident, or courageous enough to raise the flag or raise a matter. Because each one of us, irrespective of our rank, irrespective of our position, are entitled. We may not feel eligible, but we are entitled to raise our voice because we are employees of that organization. So go by your citizenship rights of being with the organization and raise the matter to the highest person. So far as internal audit, try it with the chairman of the audit committee, for example, or your independent director. I wouldn't tell you who to go to, but whoever you feel more confident in confiding in, please do that. Thank you. Next.
Yeah, so the next question is from Mr. Venkatesh S. It's a bit lengthy question, so I'll read it in parts. So he's written, I know instances where people follow ethical practices, but in order to do so, they might bend a few rules. As internal controls professional, our job is to point out such instances of bending rules. However, unwillingly, an ethical person is penalized. Oh, yeah. So there's a continuation to this.
Yes.
Yeah. However, unwillingly, an ethical person is penalized. What would you advise us on this?
I'm assuming my friend S. Venkatesh is from Siemens. He's another colleague I've had some very fond engagements with and still continue to be associated with. And Venkatesh is known to ask some beautiful questions and some pretty difficult ones as well. It's back to the drawing board in terms of such questions need to be put on the table when you have a leadership meeting of the highest level. So the CEO, no less than the CEO, and all the direct reportees to the CEO, these are the questions that need to be placed on the table. And bring out instances in how somebody who is trying to follow the rules and be compliant is still bending some rules to be ethical. And the internal control champion, which is the internal auditor in most cases, is able to spot deviation from what is expected to be done and what is not expected to be done. So here is a great point of conversation, because the way you look at it, it's a deviation. Maybe from the compliance and ethics officer, it may not be a deviation, I do not know. Or maybe from the HR side, it may not be a deviation. And most importantly, from the person who is bending the rules based on your point of view, have a conversation with him, her, or them, and have they understood the rules? Have they understood the internal controls? Have they understood the values and norms? And now they've acted. This act of theirs is in alignment with what? With values, with rules, or with the regulations that you put up? I guess they would comply with one. And I would say, amongst values, rules, and regulations, if you align with the values of the organization in correctly interpreted manner, that would be the goal test. Thank you, Venkatesh. Yes.
Yeah, so I do not see any more questions in the chat box unless Amal sir has any questions for you.
Yeah. But Alan, I have also seen in many occasions that the treatment given to the junior person and to a senior person for any unethical act is absolutely different. In your slide, you have also mentioned that there are many senior persons doing something very serious thing wrong, and they are allowed with a very small punishment, whereas for a junior person the punishment is harsh. So what you suggest to all of us, that what should we do in this scenario?
Thank you very much, Amal. Thank you also for recalling that I touched upon this contextual point in my talk. Goes back to the statement, we become what we tolerate. When top management, starting with the CEO, states something or speaks something or sends a message on something, to what extent is he or she or they 100% behind what they do, what they say, and what they write and what they speak? Unfortunately, the majority of stakeholders in any ecosystem, and I'm talking a business ecosystem, do not have occasion to speak or have an interview with the CEO or the MD. And the reason is that the CEO and the MD is handling a million things at least at the same time, while his senior leaders beneath him, each of them may be contending with a few thousand at the same time. So his time is so precious to the entire organization, and particularly for him. At the end of the day, he's a human being, so he needs to have a balance there as well. But it's an important question that should not miss the muster. So back to the table of discussion, when you have the next senior leadership meeting with the CEO, put this on the table and say, why is there apparently a different yardstick being applied to senior people as against people who are just joined, or maybe people who are on contract? Aren't they human beings? If they're entitled to be human beings, are they also part of the workforce, entitled to be part of the workforce? Are they citizens of the country, all equal? But in terms of eligibility, why are they different? Is it because he or she is senior, so they can get away with a whole lot of mischief more than somebody down the line? That, my friend, in the simplest of terms, is unfair, unjust. We need to apply the yardstick, actually, if you ask me, far more severely to senior people than for the juniors. And I have one organization, which I will not mention the name. That organization is still standing today, and the MD of the company has got rid in the last 8 to 10 years of more vice presidents and senior managers than any other Indian company for wrongdoing. And for people at the junior level, they were given chances to correct themselves, maybe one, maybe two chances in most cases. So can we modulate this yardstick to be fairer to those who are more needy in terms of the economic ladder in society than those who have more? Because if we have more and we are a higher position and we are higher performance and we are higher result oriented, shouldn't we also equally be promoted as equally demoted when the time comes? And that's a meritocratic system, sir. Both ways should apply. Thank you.
Mr. Burby, there's another question from somebody in the audience who asks if frequently avoiding a situation does also lead to tolerating the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Venugopal. This happens quite often. It's back to what we tolerate. It's not that we do not know, but we avoid it, or we delay it, or we are indifferent to it, hoping that it will go away, or sometimes quite consciously we would sweep it under the carpet. And this happens in many organizations in my experience. Anything which is swept under the carpet or we are indifferent to is going to demotivate the person who is affected at the other side of the spectrum. And we should understand, in terms of empathy, if we were on the other side of the spectrum, what would it make us feel like? What would it do to our motivation? What would it do to our performance? And we're talking of high performance cultures. High performance culture is not about just people at the top, or the senior most people, or the most capable people, or the most competent people. It's every man on board. So it's simply not accepting, because if you're indifferent to it, it relates to your character. If you are wanting it to go away and you're delaying it, that believing it won't come back to haunt you again. It may not, but you've cast your identity on stone. That's your identity. That this guy dodges issues, this guy evades issues, this guy delays issues, this guy does not confront issues. Is that the identity you want to set up in the minds of other people, in the hearts of people, in the guts of other people to remember you by? Is that the kind of reputation you want to leave people with about you? Is my remark. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah.
Manoj, do we have any other questions?
No more questions on the chat, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Burby. I think it's been a while since I've taken notes from a session. Crisp and profound, I must say. It was an enriching and an absolutely thought-provoking session. A few things I certainly want to highlight before we conclude for the day. Statements such as culture is a qualitative outcome of human relationships. You absolutely touched a chord when you said that behavior in itself is reward enough. Like you mentioned, the transgressions that we spoke about, especially in our field, we more often than not we miss the wood for the trees, and you were absolutely on target. That's exactly what happens in most of our organizations. Needless to say, that's a behavioral trait. It was profounding to hear from Mr. Tony Robbins. We become what we tolerate. A lot of us are going to sit back and think on that very deep remark. There was another specific thing that you mentioned in one of your slides, and that's left me pondering on, can we hold ourselves to account for commoditizing human capital? It is something that all of us really have to ponder on. The accountability at top leadership, the M&M example was something that a lot of organizations need to emulate. And in essence, what you've really summed it up is integrity is doing the right thing when nobody is watching. So with this, I would thank you for that wonderful session on behalf of IIA Bangalore and IIA India, for an evening well spent, for a thoroughly enriching 70 minutes, which you said would end in 75. But I must say, sir, we would certainly like to have you more often at the IIA India Bangalore chapter and at IIA India to listen to a lot more profound things that you have to say. I must thank your good friend, Mr. Amal Kundu, for all the discussions that we had and we debated on this topic. And we were just convinced that this is one of the topics that we would want to take to the larger audience. So thank you once again, and a very good evening to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, friends. Good evening.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevi. Thank you.